thank you for the great presentation yesterday. It was actually really nice to hear a presentation, process it, and then you have a conversation afterwards. We don't do that very often, and at least helped my own thinking. And really grateful for all three of you from RAND to have done this work and to come talk to us about it.
Great, my pleasure. I'm Chris Stoss from RAND for the record, and it's our pleasure. Thank you for having us.
And do you two want to identify yourselves for the record, and then we can dive in?
Hello, Lynn Carolee from RAND for the record.
Thanks.
And Aaron Strong.
Thank you. So we could are you just diving right into questions with everyone, or do you have any final thoughts?
It's whatever works for you. Happy to just take questions,
Yeah.
or if you need some background, happy to provide that as well.
I think we got the background yesterday. I have a pile of questions myself, but I would rather other people start. So does anyone else have a question? Okay, I'm going to dive right. Thank you. Please go on in, Representative Sims.
Yeah, thank you. Of course, how helpful to have this framing for this really important conversation. I have a couple of different questions. I'm not totally sure where to start, so I'll just pick one. I'm curious whether you all might have thoughts about how we might think about the impact of these changes on ECE labor participation. So if we're maybe leveling up salaries for leads and assistants, did you all consider, or do you have recommendations for what that might do in terms of the ECE labor market, and does that potentially impact tax revenues as more folks are entering that workforce and seeing an increase in salary?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, as you all are probably acutely aware, even predating COVID, the ECE labor market was tight, right? The compensation is relatively low, and that means there's a lot of turnover. It's hard to create a workforce with that. Then COVID hit, and all of the education system, of course, had a lot of disruptions, but ECE was hit probably even harder because these kind of low compensations then interact with unique and acute stresses, which causes even a greater labor market crisis. So when we think about the ECE system as a whole and kind of this march towards higher credentials and commensurate pay, part of it is how do you attract people with the skills and that you need in order to provide high quality care. So our models do assume this higher level of compensation, in part due to recognize the skill that they would have and ideally the bachelor's and associate's degrees that the system would require. What study 2 then did said, taking this whole package as a whole, right, which includes kind of the labor force effects, what would happen to the Vermont economy. And so what we saw is that we estimated between 600 to 2,800 new workers would be added to the Vermont economy as a whole. That's kind of a net change. So what would likely happen is that parents who otherwise stay out of the labor market because of the cost of childcare, they would enter the market. But then there would also be a reshuffling of workers, right? So if ECE becomes more attractive, some of those new entrants might go into ECE, but also likely some workers in other sectors would be pulled back into ECE because perhaps that's where they want to be, but don't go because of the low compensation in the first place. So all of that is modeled in our kind of aggregate estimates. And so when we say that the gross state product would grow between 50 to over $200 million, and when revenues would grow between 1.5 or $18 million a year, that takes into account the fact that you're attracting people into the market generally and into ECE as part of that.
Okay, so that total labor force increase includes folks who might be attracted to ECE, as well as parents who are just coming back because they now have childcare.
Correct. Yes.
Great. Okay, thank you. So I noticed.
I have a labor force participation question.
Yeah.
Before the next one is not labor force participation.
I'll log in my computer, but continue. I can do 2 things at once.
In that increased labor force participation rate on the parents' part, less than the ECE provider part, early childhood education for anyone who.
Sorry, yes.
Did you look at movements from part-time to full-time?
That is mostly the extensive margin going into it. So there could be some movement also from part-time to full-time. Lynn or Aaron, did you want to add more on that while I log in? Sorry.
I think just to say that that's an area where there's a gap in our knowledge about how parents are going to respond to reduced cost of childcare. Most of the evidence is whether or not you have new entrants into the labor market. So parents who are out of the labor force enter the labor force, just because there's kind of less data to look at. Do they go from part-time work to full-time work? Or exactly how many more hours they'll work. We just don't have a lot of data to make that kind of an estimate. We would expect that there, just based on economic theory, that as you lower the cost of care, that could induce some parents to increase their hours over what they might have been working, before the expanded subsidies were available.
Okay. And then similarly, in terms of new folks entering the labor force, I know you counted on parents entering the labor force. Did you also look at sort of the broader ecosystem of care, grandparents who had perhaps retired early to care for grandchildren who might be going back into the labor force from there, the formal labor force from there?
I would say that, again, it's hard to know for some of what current providers, some of whom are uncompensated, like grandparents or other relatives. Sometimes you might think of it as a more casual workforce, that circumstances lead them to provide childcare under, for a certain period of time. It's their grandchild, but they're not committed to being a member of the early childhood workforce. So we tended to focus on the more formal part of the early care and education sector. And that includes both the actual providers, the institutions, centers, and family child care homes that were in the licensed or registered system, rather than trying to capture the less formal part of the labor market, which is just much less studied to understand how their behavior might change, with these kinds of circumstances.
And I wasn't asking about, I'm sorry to clarify, I wasn't asking about informal care becoming formalized care. I was asking about people who are beyond the nuclear family providing informal care, who would then go on to other jobs because they weren't needed for that informal care any longer. I have a lot of colleagues in the colleagues in the legislature who have retired early to care for grandkids and would probably be happy to go back to work.
So our estimates do cover the general working age adults, right? Okay. No matter what their age are. To the extent that people go out of retirement or something, they'll probably go around the edges, but our estimates do look at all working age adults and what their expected behavior.
Okay, thanks. Anyone? Okay, Representative Sims, back to you.
Okay, so shifting to kind of thinking about the types of centers we have and the stars and how that might affect distribution of funding under a proposed model. I noticed it seems like we have primarily two types of childcare providers: the smaller centers, 6 to 40 slots, and then registered family childcare homes, and that there's a real difference around stars rating in the two types of centers, with 80% of centers having that 4 or 5 star, and just 30 of our in-home daycare providers having that 4 or 5 star rating. And as you built the model, is the assumption that whatever your star rating, you'd be eligible for the sort of same level of funding, or does stars impact the level of funding that a childcare provider would receive?
That's great. So we costed out what a system that has high quality features would look like. And those features that we costed out were both features that the research supports as high quality, but it's also commensurate with 5-star ratings in the current system. So in a sense, we are saying what happens if all childcare in the state, regardless of family childcare homes or centers, provide 5-star quality to children in the state, what would that cost? That being said, there are some states that do what we call tiered reimbursement. And so they tie the level of reimbursement to the stars, right? So that if you have a 4 or 5 star rating center that presumably has more expensive inputs because of providing higher quality care, then the subsidy system would reimburse them at a higher rate than, let's say, a 3-star system. That tiered reimbursement system wasn't necessarily in our, because we're basically assuming that there'd be 5-star quality across these different types of providers.
Okay, so to repeat back what I think I hear you saying is that the study sort of assumed costs for all centers would be at the 5-star level.
Right.
What happens to centers that aren't at that 5-star level? Maybe that's a policy question or discussion for us.
Yeah, that's correct. And it kind of goes into how do you phase in the system, right? So it's unlikely that you'd pass legislation and then next September suddenly everything is 5 stars, right? And so the question,
so easy once we have
yeah, exactly, right. So the question then becomes, how do you upskill the current workforce, current providers? How do you to provide that so that they can be reimbursed for providing that quality of care?
And I'll offer that won't necessarily be ours to figure out, but down the halls to figure out.
Yes, okay, just want to make sure that we're not
Yeah.
leaving any centers behind because they all are important.
Absolutely.
And thinking about the geographic distribution of those different types of centers, meeting different needs of different sized communities.
Representative Odie.
No,
Okay.
my question was answered.
Yep. And then Representative Andrews.
I just, on page 29, there's a table 2.13. I'm just not sure I understand what's going on in the lower portion of that where the numbers are over 100%.
What table are you on again? I'm sorry.
Table 2.13 on page 29.
And share that on the screen.
Oh, that would be the best. Thanks.
The report or the presentation?
150, 694, and 132.
Yeah, Lynn, did you want to explain that?
Yeah, let me speak to that. So what this table looks at is the current structure of subsidized early care and education, and what population is targeted and what proportion of that targeted population is currently reached. And we do that separately because the amount of funding in the system varies for infants and toddlers, what we call 0, 1, and 2-year-olds, from the preschoolers, what we refer to as 3 and 4-year-olds. So to take one example, the top panel, which is referring to the 0, 1, and 2-year-olds, there are 2 main funding streams that are currently available to subsidize childcare or early learning programs at those ages. It's Early Head Start, which is federally funded, and then the Child Care Family Assistance Program, CCFAP, which is a combination of federal and state funds that Vermont administers. And so what you see in the first column is the number of children currently reached by those programs. So 482 children in Early Head Start and just a little over 2,000 children receiving subsidies at those ages for CCFAP. Then we say, well, which children are eligible for Early Head Start? In that case, it's children and families with income up to 1 times poverty. At those ages, there are roughly about 2,300 infants and toddlers in that age group whose family income falls below poverty. So that current enrollment of 482 children is reaching about 21% of that eligible population. In the case of CCFAP, it actually goes up to 3.5 times poverty, for which there are at that age about 10,300 children. So with current enrollment or recipients of about 2,000 children, if you look at the next column over, it's about 20% of that targeted population that are being reached by CCFAP. Another way of looking at it is if you could concentrate all the CCFAP money in families with children below poverty, you could reach 86% of that population. But because it's spread out further up the income distribution, you're reaching about 20%. And then if you were to look at the entire population of children 0 to 2, you're reaching through early Head Start about 3% of the overall population. So that is both the targeted group plus all other children. And CCFAP is reaching about 12% of children. So that's a way of thinking about how far do those funding streams reach in terms of the overall population or these targeted groups. The reason why you get some numbers that are over 100%, and that happens really in the lower table, is because Head Start is still targeted to the lowest income, having income below poverty. So the Head Start number of children served of 965 is reaching about close to 75% of children at those ages with income below poverty. So that's how far Head Start is reaching. CCFAP, again, is not just targeting the lowest income, but if it did, it would be enough funding to serve all of those below poverty. But when you move up to the fact that it actually goes up to 3.5 times poverty, it's reaching close to 30% of that eligible population. And for all children, it's reaching about 16%. And then UPK is different still because it's not targeted. It's meant to reach potentially all children in the state. So looking at those very narrow targeted groups like children below poverty, children up to 3.5 times poverty, the current number of children served is more than enough to reach all those in poverty, more than enough to reach those at 3.5 times poverty, and actually is reaching about 74% of the population overall, which as a universal program is a high percentage of those of the universal group, all children at those ages that the program is designed to serve. So I hope that clarifies how to read that particular table. And it kind of depends on whether you're thinking about a targeted group or all children, and separately noting the difference between the subsidy system and its reach for the youngest children versus the 3 and the 4-year-olds.
Okay, thank you. I think I've got it.
Representative Andrews?
Yeah, I just wanted to do a language clarification on Representative Sims' question, and feel free to jump in, which is, I think what I heard you talking about was centers and not wanting to disincentivize centers. And we also don't want to disincentivize family childcare homes, or in my view. So like, if you're talking about assuming everybody's at a 5-star rating, that assumes childcare homes as well.
Correct.
Okay, thank you very much.
Representative Beck, and then I'm going to jump in.
In this, is there any assumption of wage controls or price controls for services, or is it just the market's just gonna figure this out?
So what we do is we cost, let's say, the ingredients of high quality, right? And so those ingredient prices would be set by the market. And so maybe you're worried about the inflationary pressures. So for example, because we express everything in 2022 dollars, all the current inflation up to 2022 has been accounted for in those numbers that we presented to you. But going forward, yes, the market would set it. The compensation we kind of peg towards something that more like the kindergarten teachers would have this commensurate levels of responsibility and education would work out as well.
I do want to just add to that, to note that yes, the market will be determining the prices of the ingredients, but in most state systems, just as you do with any other goods and services that the public sector pays for, you could establish a procurement process or process just like you do now under CCFAP at the level at which you're going to reimburse providers. CCFAP currently reimburses providers based on the prices that they charge in the market. Most providers don't price the cost of care at their true costs. They price it based on what they think parents can pay, as well as what they're going to be reimbursed by the CCFAP system. So you sort of get this circular system. Most states that are, for example, paying beyond what the low levels of reimbursement that many providers see, that want to tie or provide an incentive for quality, increase the reimbursement rates if you have higher quality ratings, for example. So linking to your quality rating system, a 5-star provider would get a higher reimbursement than, say, a 1-star provider. One way of determining what that reimbursement rate should be is by using cost modeling. And in fact, the federal government, under its requirements for the Child Care Development Fund, which is where the federal money comes in to pay for CCFAP, requires now states to use cost information as part of setting reimbursement rates. So not relying solely on price data, but recognizing that in many states, those reimbursement rates are too low for providers to be able to even stay in business because they're not covering their costs, and they're certainly not covering the cost of quality. Another possibility is that Vermont could use a contract-based approach, that you would contract with providers and establish what, again, reimbursement rates would look like, even at the level of an individual provider, looking at their cost structure. And just like you might in purchasing other services, you might have certain allowable costs, non-allowable costs. You could monitor what's happening to cost structures over time, and be making decisions about what that reimbursement looks like and that contracting process looks like. So there are ways to bring accountability to both providers achieving the levels of quality that are assumed, and then to the process of reimbursing providers, reflecting the costs of quality, where you might say, certain things we are not going to reimburse for because we think that goes beyond what's indicated for quality. Whereas, and this would even be a place where you could build in the required salary schedule to say that we are expecting that you're compensating your staff according to this compensation schedule, and that's built into the contract process as well. So I hope that answers maybe a little bit beyond sort of the way that the market plays into it, but also the role that the state has in reimbursing providers for these services.
Thank you.
Given that we only have an hour together, I'd love to spend the second half of the hour, which we're coming up on soon, on the second half of the report, which is the new side of the conversation. So I'm going to ask a question before we pivot into that. Also, we're going to have many more conversations about this. So I think the more trying to focus on just sort of understanding the report at this point, and then figuring out what to do next at a later point. On table 3.3, which is the cost of care by setting, I understand that small, medium, and large centers are based on the number of kids enrolled. If the early care and education is happening in a setting that is a larger setting with more children around, but not more young children around, say a pre-K program in a school, would that be considered a large center because of sort of the other administrative apparatus and, provision of cleaning supply system, all of those sort of efficiencies of scale? Or would that still be a small center based on the number of kids?
So this is based on the desired enrollment. So those larger enrollments would be considered a large center, and those scales, those economies of scale is exactly why it costs less for those large centers than from the smaller centers. The contracting mechanism that Lynn said could be one mechanism in which you kind of take into account those individual level idiosyncrasies. So for example, if you're based in a school and you don't necessarily pay rent, through a contracting mechanism, you can kind of reimburse providers based on the cost of what they actually incur in providing services that are not already taken care of. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Not quite.
Okay.
So if I was looking at the cost of care for a situation where there were only, say, 8 children between the age of, 3 and 5 enrolled, but it was in a larger administrative apparatus and building like a school, like a public school, where there were another 1,000 children that were between the ages of
Oh.
5 and 12, what would the cost of care be in your
That would
model?
be, that would be small. So
It would
this
be,
is just
still be
for-
small, it's
Yeah,
just for the, okay.
Yes,
So like the buying of the paper towels doesn't matter.
correct.
Great, okay, thank you.
And on a per child basis, most of the costs, close to 80%, will be in
Yeah.
personnel. But that doesn't
Yes.
change the kinds of savings that you're talking about. Yes, you could account for that and how they were actually reimbursed, but for the kinds of estimates we're producing, those are, small levels of variation.
Representative Sims, do you have another one?
Yeah, sort of two other questions. One around the modeling. Did you look beyond families that are at 500% of the federal poverty level? And do you have a sense of like what the impacts of this new system might be on families above that and their ability to access care?
So in our models, we do not assume subsidies beyond 500%. In our study too, that macroeconomic effect, we take into all families. And we find that in general, kind of like they'd have aggregately small effects on welfare. Of course, now your particular circumstances would be different. So a couple of things though. First, the current system only subsidizes up to 3.5 times poverty. So this in essence kind of extends that beyond that to a higher income. That's not necessarily there. And that income would cover about 80% of all children under 5 in Vermont. So 80% of children under 5 in Vermont would get some sort of subsidy if you go up to 500% of poverty. The current system that goes up to 3.5 times poverty covers about 60% of children in Vermont under 5. Also, just to kind of give you like a flavor of what kind of income that does is for a family of 3, that's an income of 500% is an income of 115,000. Or for a family of 5, that's an income of 162,000. So anybody above those incomes under these would not have a benefit, but those would be higher income, at least relative to their peers in Vermont.
And I guess the question here is like, do you feel confident that the model and the size investment proposed will allow all families to sufficiently access care at all those different income levels?
Right. So what we did, part of our modeling is to figure out approximately how many would take you up on that offer. So, you're not every single person with children from ages 0 to 5 will necessarily purchase care for a variety of personal preferences. And so based on the research on the data of how people respond to these incentives, we said how many people are likely to take it up and then how much of that costs. So the goal was to cost out the price of what would be needed for what we expect the demand would be.
And as we shift to thinking about the funding sources and options, I'm curious if you're able to provide a little context about how these recommendations might compare to sort of other states and what they're doing. How similar or different, and that sort of size and scale of investment are these recommendations?
Yeah, so what we tried to do in giving you those is to try to benchmark those tax rates against what is seen in others, right? So what we do is we say we don't want to take a rate of any single tax above what you've seen, at least in our report, above what you would see. So these are the options to try to keep those within the limits of what's typically seen in the United States.
So these recommendations are not at significant odds with our neighbors.
That's right. So one conclusion from the report, though, is that we give you 6 options. The first 4 rely on a single source, and then the last 2 bundle different sources. The less generous subsidies, let's say if you want to keep it to 3.5 times poverty as a group that gets it, could be covered by one source and keep it within the levels that you've seen in the country. If you look at the more generous subsidies that go up to 500% of poverty, that becomes, you could still do it with one source, but that would take you to levels that are above what's seen, which is why we then propose these bundles that keep any one rate below that kind of maximum threshold.
So the particular funding sources or revenue sources that you proposed are a fairly narrow slice of revenue options available in the grand scheme of revenue. And what I heard you say previously was that you were looking for the most stable revenue sources. I'm curious if you looked at other policy tools to stabilize a perhaps slightly less stable revenue source that we use.
So I think our charge was to get a look at that stable. So we were trying to veer away from circumstances where you posit perhaps less stable and then posit on top of that policy choices, which has even more kind of uncertainties in order to stabilize the unstableness, right? So we kind of saw this as a
Nice sentence.
Yeah. So, that's, as you go there, it becomes a lot harder to model it. It's a little bit of uncharted territory. And so we decided to give the most concrete numbers. And again, these are like possibilities, right? We're not saying that any one of these possibilities are the way to go.
Certainly.
So our goal was to say, here's a roadmap, here's some parameters to kind of give you a feel for what's possible. Go and you can go and mix and choose as you please, or go for somewhere else that we didn't. But we kind of were trying to stay as clear to the act as possible of making sure that at least the options we give you, would be stable and sustainable.
And on that same track, I think one of the most stable revenue sources, much discussed and used historically, is property taxes. Our education fund is already funded in part by property taxes. I'm curious why you stayed away from that conversation and away from our education fund.
Yeah, so.
Because Nolan told you to, I really don't know.
No. So property taxes in Vermont are a bit complicated, but the data that we have would not be able to model the complexity of those increases accurately. And so that's why we didn't want.
Because it was just too complicated.
Given the data that we have.
Okay, Representative Taylor.
Page 47, when you're getting into the various sources of revenue, potential sources of revenue. About
Yes.
Midway through the page, there's a paragraph that starts with our aim. And I think the next to last sentence is, we do not include legal or financial services as these are mainly supporting businesses rather than households. And the next one down, next paragraph down, you stress that they are, it is supporting households. I'm wondering about the logic behind that, why you're taking some of the services out and some in. It seems to me that businesses also and financial services also benefit from early childcare.
Yep. Aaron, did you want to take that one?
Yeah, so the way that we came about with these groupings of different potential services is we were looking at really final demand. So demand by households, that we didn't want to get into a situation where we had business to business service taxes taking place. So we were really focused in on what are those services that households use, and try to exclude as much as we could those services that are much more concentrated in businesses. Yes, households do use legal services. Yes, they do use financial services, but these are the end use services rather than, if I think about it, the analog of a sales tax, we don't tax business to business transactions. We only tax those final demand, those consumptions. And so what we're trying to do is have a parallel to a sales and use tax, but on the service sector rather than on the goods sector.
Okay.
Quite a policy choice.
That's good. Thanks. Okay.
Okay, I'm gonna keep on going. There's a sentence somewhere near the end here that I can't find, and I didn't flag, I'm so sorry, that basically said in your modeling, these revenue sources wouldn't have a fundamental impact on families' well-being. Tell me about that. And do you know where the sentence is by any? It's okay if you don't.
I don't.
Okay.
So when economists kind of look at economic well-being, right, you kind of look at the big picture of like what your income is going to be versus the taxes you pay versus the services you get. And so if you think about kind of the big overall economy and how that goes, you're going to have some families that have more income, you're going to have some families that pay more taxes, but they're also going to get more subsidies. And so kind of what our models show that when you take everything in aggregate, on average for a family, everything's going to even out pretty much okay, and that you're not going to get a big hit in welfare, and that even if you look at different parts of the income distribution from lower to higher, that's the case. Aaron, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
What I point you to is table 4.4. That gives us the sort of the welfare impacts across these different ranges across these different instruments across all different, a set of 10 or 9 or so households. And so what you're seeing there is what is the, in some sense, change in well-being to the households from these changes in taxes. Mm-hmm. And what we see is all those numbers are really between 1.01 and 0.99. And really it's even higher than that. So any of these potential approaches for funding would have very little impact on households.
And so to read this, 1 means you're exactly the same as before. If you're a little bit lower than 1, that means you're taking a little bit of a hit. If you're above 1, that means you're getting a little bit extra benefit.
And we looked at sort of a similar conceit yesterday when we were looking at the earned income tax credit and how it sort of matched up with other taxes people paid. Another question, and backtracking a little bit in the study, when you were looking at revenue that's already going into the system and already paying for the system under current law, and you were looking at pre-K money, were you looking at them, when you looked at that, was that the amount of money that's being paid out to providers through pre-K, or the amount that districts are spending on pre-K, or how much we're accounting for in the tax system with pre-K? Because those are 3 different numbers.
Yeah, Lynn, do you want to have the most accurate answer for that?
Yeah, so we're using estimates of what the state has reported for other reporting purposes. The National Institute for Early Care and Education has an annual pre-K report and reports what states are spending. So we're basing on that estimate, which I believe is going to be the state and local spending specific to the pre-K program, which it's been a little unclear exactly how that relates to the 3 different ways in which you describe that it could be measured. But the intent was to try to capture the public dollars basically in the pre-K part of the system, and specifically the direct expenditures for children, whether they're in public schools or in private settings.
Okay, thank you. Representative Sims, do you have more? I think I cut you off.
I mean, we're like in between lunch and everything, but
We have 15 more minutes.
okay. So I noticed the reference to sort of additional considerations around special ed costs that, from my understanding from constituents and communities, is a real challenge for our centers around meeting the increased needs and costs. And I see that you all did not account for that, but sort of suggest that that might be an additional 1% increase. Could you just share a little bit more about that and what you see as next steps to?
Sure. Yeah. So to kind of contextualize that number, it's a little bit, that kind of costing that out is a little bit difficult, but estimates say that about 10% of the kids would be expected to have some sort of special education services required below 5. Those kids are already accounted for in the system in that they are given the same level of funding as all the other children. So some of their care would already be in that system. So when we talk about extra costs for those children, they would be the costs on top of what's already provided for as normal per course. Some of the quality features that you would expect for special education could be captured in that higher quality level that we're costing out. So for example, if you want to employ somebody that has a bachelor's degree in special education in early childhood, that would be part of the cost of having a bachelor's degree that's already in that. So we're talking about kind of marginal specialized services that these kids would need, which we came up to about 10%. So we're talking about a 10% increase in marginal costs for a 10% population, which is how we get to that 1% number. And so that kind of contextualizes how we got there.
And how does existing funding for CIS and Triple E weave into that?
So that the existing funding is not in the revenue sources of that table. So we didn't want to not account for special education services, but then count the money that's in the system. I thought that'd be a little unfair. So some of that could be recouped by the money that would be going into the system.
Some of the 1%.
Yeah.
Sort of started to get at this, I think, in this answer around sort of opportunities to expand quality care for special ed. But I guess we'd love to hear a little bit more about sort of, if we really zoom back, like what the outcomes of this investment might have for Vermont families. We probably all easily understand that goal of, family paying less than 10% of their income for childcare as a parent to small children. I get that at a very tangible level. And I think I also hear you all describing the opportunity to sort of expand quality, like this will help provide greater investment, which will help ensure quality care for everyone. Could you all talk a little bit more about what that might mean for centers and programs and impacts on families?
Yeah, so what the report tried to do is battle those effects, those more immediate effects, right? And we take into account a lot. So for employers and families, we're talking about, some families getting more income because of their in ECE, some families having more income because they go into the workforce with the stable care. That's all kind of taken into account. It shows that we'll expand the Vermont economy between over $200 million a year in gross state product, depending on subsidy schedules and assumptions. And it also shows the increased revenue taxes for localities in the state on the order of $1.5 to $18 million a year based on that. There are some more anecdotal, harder to measure benefits that families might be able to capture as well. So lower stress, for example, about with taking care of young children. We talked about perhaps working more hours because now you have a more stable source of care, even if you're already in the labor market. We're talking about perhaps being able to concentrate more at work because you don't have to deal with as many childcare emergencies if they're in a more stable funding. Because those are a little bit more anecdotal, but they're also a little bit harder to quantify, so they're not quite captured in this report, but those all could also be other benefits. And then there's long-term.
Thank you for that. And I guess just to maybe clarify my question a little bit more, I think looking for more kind of detail around the quality of care that might be offered to kids in those centers. I think you're saying this is an opportunity to level up salaries.
Sure.
And maybe provide more enrichment and sort of, ensure that all kids who are receiving care have a leveling up in that quality of care.
Yeah, exactly. And so we show that there is some variation in the quality of care right now in Vermont STARS. It's more so across sectors of the ECE, but even within sectors, there's that variation. And so, when we think about this as an investment, we think it's important because a lot of the research shows that the inputs into a child's education when they're young, up to 5, is really consequential for a lot of long-term outcomes. So we're learning more and more about how the child's brain develops between 0 and 5, how much they're able to absorb between 0 and 5, which is a lot more than we previously thought, and how those foundations really how those skills that they learn really set the foundation for advanced work as they progress through school and in society. And so the research also shows that high quality inputs, so having teachers that recognize the science behind that and then engage in instruction that builds those types of skills is what kind of drives a lot of those benefits. And so that's part of the reason why you want to try to induce quality as much as possible, but then also make sure that there is a decrease in variation of that quality so that things like disparities between income or race and class are not correlated with the types of care that they get. Lynn, I know you have your hand raised.
I was just going to add, it sounded like you were also asking about what it might look like in a typical center family childcare home at the levels of quality that we're assuming. So I just wanted to say a few things about that. So in costing out in that estimate that we have on the per child cost and then the aggregate cost. So not only are we assuming that you have well-qualified workforce, they're compensated at a level consistent with their skills and competencies and education, but that those staff are in a supportive environment where they're not expected that their full day is spent in contact with young children, that a portion of their day is set aside for planning for what's going to happen over the next day, the next week in general, but also focused on individual children, doing developmental assessments of each child, developing individualized approaches to support a child's learning. And that is one way in which, for example, you're supporting both children with special needs as well as typically developing children, which increasingly the goal is to do that in inclusive settings rather than segregating out the children with special needs into separate classrooms. So the ways in which we've built the teaching and the staffing structures, not only 2 teachers per classroom, but somebody we call a floater who's there to relieve either the lead teacher or the assistant for that time that they need for non-contact time for professional development, to have the hours of holidays and vacations that they need in order to have this be a job that you can do and succeed in, and a job that you want to stay in because of having those kinds of a supportive environment. We also, have assumptions about leadership in programs. We're learning a lot more about the role that, say, a center director plays, as well as having an assistant or associate director who might be focused on curriculum, quality improvement. So I'd be happy to say more about that, but we detail many of those assumptions and features because we think it's important to recognize that quality is not just something that you sort of say in words and just you get the BA level teacher and you're done, but it's really about this whole aspect of the environment so that these centers and family child care homes operate in, and the way that they support the staff, but also the way in which they work with children.
Thank you.
I also imagine that in this scenario, we would have a stabilized ECE workforce, which, given the situation now where, we have centers that are closed 1 day a week because of staffing shortages. We talked about parents being more focused at work, but I think we're talking about parents going to work, even parents with full-time jobs, like we're having, which, as part of even in our legislature, we have staff who can't come in certain days because their childcare centers are closed. So I think what I heard you say, I just want to confirm, is that those impacts on the economy are being modeled as well, is that employees are able to actually come in every day because their childcare centers are reliable. Okay. Representative Beck, and then I have another question.
The family contribution schedules that you use, does that assume one child or multiple children?
Figure 2.2 would be a great place to answer that question.
Figure 2.2. Yeah, it preserves the current system that it's independent of the number of children that you have.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you go deeper on figure 2.2, which I find slightly confusing?
Sure.
Can you just add on?
22.
Oops. 2.2, you said?
2.2 on page
Table?
22, figure.
Oh,
Sorry, what page is it on?
I have a figure, page 22, figure 2.2.
Yes, okay. So this is the current system. It's a little bit of a complicated graph, so I'll try to walk you through it.
Thank you.
What we showed in the presentation were a little bit more stylized of this. So the current subsidy system subsidizes families of 3 and higher. And what the current subsidy system does is, depending on where you fall, it requires a certain number of cash per week. So for example, if you're between 150 and 175, you pay $25 a week, independent of the number of children you have. If you pay...
Someone with 5 children would be paying $25 a week, and someone with 2 children would be paying $25.
Somebody had 5 children under the age of 5, yes, they would be paying $25 a week.
Some people
It does.
somehow.
It absolutely does.
Okay.
Yes.
Almost did that.
Scott, you did do that.
I was
Yeah.
almost did that.
Yes.
Yeah.
400.
And so what this shows is what, and then between 175 and 200%, that goes up to 50. So for every basically 25% increment, it goes up another $25. So what these kind of steps show is that as you go up, you have to pay more, right? Which is why in general it goes to higher levels of your income. But it also slopes down a little bit because you're making more if you're 150 to let's say 174. So that $25 a week is a slightly less percentage of your income if you're making 1.74 times the poverty than 1.5. So it slopes down a little bit, it jumps up, slopes down a little bit and jumps up, and so on and so forth.
So I guess maybe what I don't understand is, so it says family contribution as a percentage of family income. So would a family of 6 pay a reduced percentage of their income than a family of 2?
Yeah, so the black lines, which are the family of 6, generally pay less than a family of 2 because the income poverty level goes up, right? So it was a higher threshold for the federal poverty level if you have a family of 6.
But all
That's
the kids are receiving services.
Sure.
Okay, all right, okay.
Thank you. That last point was what I missed in the chart.
Yeah.
And correct me if I'm wrong, I think there's an underlying, in order to qualify for CCFAP, you do have to have a qualifying need for care, regardless of family income, correct?
There is no, yes, you do have a qualifying.
I have this weird one wonky thing that drives me crazy. I think my understanding is if you are self-employed and even if your family has a net gross annual income, if you have a loss in a business year, you're not eligible for CCFAP, even if you're income eligible, because the way we determine a qualifying need for care is that you have to have, is based on minimum wage, and if you show a net loss, you maybe shouldn't be working because your business showed a net loss and you should just stay home for your. Just need to.
And just so you know,
Household
Drives me
income
crazy.
can't be negative for a self-employed person. It's the same problem.
I think Lynn wants to jump
Sorry.
in if we could.
yeah, just to say that feature of the current system is one that we do not assume applies in this system
That's what
this approach we're modeling. So there's no tie between accessing subsidized care and a requirement that you are employed. And you can see that the employment rates are already very high among families with young children. So I think the concern, the history of this all goes back to AFDC and then TANF welfare programs and building in work requirements tied to receipt of child care subsidy. So we have not continued that expectation.
Thank you. Will you, as we dive deeper into like very specific pieces of this, are you all available over the next few months for further questions?
So our contract with the JFO ends mid-April. So, so I think if you could pass questions to Nolan,
Absolutely.
pass questions to us, and then we could provide answers.
Okay, thank you. Really appreciate that and really appreciate your time and the opportunity to dive into this with you.
So.
It's an important issue for all of us. Thank you.